Welcome to the Meet Me podcast, a podcast all about our multifaceted human nature and constant journey through self-discovery, with personal stories and insights around trauma, motherhood, relationships, spirituality, and individuality. I'm your host, Michelle Malik. Thanks for listening. Hello, welcome back to the Meet Me podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Malik, and through this podcast, I hope to help others to view their experiences and trauma and turn them into power, purpose, and connection through open and vulnerable conversations. I am excited to share another guest conversation with you today. And to be honest, I was not sure if I was going to make it to release an episode this week. The last couple weeks have been a little bit of a whirlwind, and it is funny how the universe works its magic sometimes, because shortly after recording this episode, which focuses heavily on shadows, both on an individual and collective basis, I feel this conversation, in addition to my Shaman Academy that I've been in for the past 8 weeks now, has really given me a push to dive deeper into my soul, definitely dive deeper into my shadows. And I certainly thought that I had done a lot of shadow work. I had definitely faced a lot of the things that were difficult to look at. Unfortunately, I, didn't see it all. And I think that is just part of the journey. There's always going to be new layers that we uncover, and sometimes they'll be harder to process than others. I certainly have been having a difficult time in processing some of the newly surfaced information, which I do plan to share on the podcast eventually once I get to a more level spot with everything. But I wanted to start out by just sharing that in case this maybe initiates that deep shadow work for you through listening to my conversation today with Lena Papadopoulos. She is a coach and a mentor who specializes in shadow work, and I really enjoyed having this conversation with her and talking about some of the issues that we see in the world and how they are rooted in shadows that people typically tend to refrain from looking at. Shadow work is kind of the ugly side of healing and spirituality. And so it's not always the sexiest thing to want to work or look at our shadows. But if you are on this healing journey like I am, I encourage you to ask some questions, remain curious, be open to what arrives, and be gentle with yourself in the process as well. Even with my newly uncovered shadow that is now brought up to the surface, and I'm working on shining light on that, it's been quite difficult. And I am just trying to give myself as much grace as I move through it. Know that whatever comes up, you're never alone. There is always going to be other people out there who can understand you, who have gone through something similar. And so I just hope that you're able to connect and find that community or find those resources so that you don't feel like you're going through it alone. As we discuss throughout this conversation, it takes a lot of courage to look at our shadows and want to make those changes. So thank you so much for tuning in. As always, I appreciate your time and your energy, and look forward to hearing your thoughts on the episode. And if it awakens anything in you, I'd love to have a conversation about it. As always, you can find me on Instagram or on Threads at meetme-michelle. Let's go ahead and dive into the episode. Welcome to the Meet Me podcast. Today I'm joined by Lena. Lena, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me today.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Yes, absolutely. I'm so excited to dive into our conversation, and really wanted to start by giving you the opportunity to introduce yourself to the listeners. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what it is that you do.
Yeah, so I am a life purpose and leadership coach, and my work is really centered around bringing humanity back to the forefront of everything we do, or system structures, policies. And I believe that one of the biggest reasons there is a division between people is that is a reflection of a disconnection within. And so a lot of my work is focused on highlighting sort of the shadow parts of self so that we can understand how they play out on a bigger scale in the collective. And that any individual healing we do is really for the purpose of healing the collective, and creating a more just world. So that's a little snippet.
Such powerful work that you're doing, and to focus in that area, I think is so essential right now, especially with everything that's been going on in the world. Tell us a little bit about how you fell into this. How did you discover that that was sort of something that you really wanted to provide as a service, or how you found that calling?
Well, there are a lot of layers to this.
Mhm.
Firstly, I grew up in the US. My parents were both immigrants from Greece. Um, and so I kind of had this experience of navigating this weird space between cultures where I wasn't really like American enough. I wasn't Greek enough, but then I was also like too American or too Greek. And so that was a big part of kind of, yeah, it just shaped how I experienced and viewed the world. And then I also, coming from this background of Greek ancestry, my great grandparents on both sides actually fled a genocide against the Greeks that happened in Turkey in the 20s, the 1920s.
Mhm.
So weird that we're like in the
I
2020s,
know.
but um, yeah, in the 1920s. And on one side, my great grandparents lived until I was in my late teens. So I was very sort of familiar with their lived experience. And then on the other side, my grandfather in particular had been very affected and impacted by um yeah, just by the murder of his family and his ancestors. And so this was always a big part of sort of the discourse or the narrative that I was around. This very much like us against them, this othering that happens between Greeks and Turks, like on a general level, right? Like collectively, it's a little bit different when we look at individual relationships, but on the collective, there is this narrative of like we're immortal, eternal enemies. And that really shaped the way that I saw the world as well, because I couldn't really understand that hatred, even though I could understand that it was rooted in deep, deep pain. It didn't really make sense to me. And so as I got older, I got very involved in international communities and cultural exchange programs. And I started running cross-cultural exchange programs and teaching intercultural communication. And my goal was really to like bridge this divide between people, between groups of people. And I wanted to build common ground and build bridges between difference and help people understand the roots of their unconscious bias. And this kind of led me into the leadership development space. And I worked a lot with young leaders who wanted to have a global impact. And so there was a big focus on like global issues and global citizenship in the work that I was doing. And then I moved on to focus more on the the personal element, sort of really that deep self-discovery and self-awareness, and understanding how these patterns that we see in the collective are really rooted in our own personal experiences and our personal traumas and how they become projected.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, and so the last like 5 years since I've had my business, I've really been focused on that more personal piece. And now I'm kind of returning to my roots and I'm really transitioning more into the group spaces and leadership development and global leadership. So
And it kind of brought it all full circle of like where your roots were, where are these kind of ideas and thoughts about how people connect with each other, how different communities connect with each other, and then kind of breaking that down into an individual basis. And now sort of seeing how things have panned out in recent years, it's like kind of going back to the roots of the collective and how we can bridge that gap with the community. So I think that's beautiful work that you're doing. And you talk to a lot of important parts too, just being like a first generation American. I know a lot of people can relate to that. I know I myself come from a Filipino background. So same thing of like being too Asian, not being Asian enough, being, too American for my family, those types of things. And so that can be really difficult, but I also see it as a bit of a blessing that you were kind of like outside of it, because I think it's so much harder for people in those cultures and in those communities when that's all that they're surrounded by. It's really difficult for them to kind of get that bird's eye perspective to see like, oh, maybe we're all just humans and maybe we don't need to have this discord. Did you feel that way as well? Like you kind of were able to see differently than maybe your family or the people that were around you at that time?
Yes, exactly. I feel like it really expanded and broadened my worldview. And just because I grew up from such a young age being like a part of two very different worlds and different sets of values and expectations and norms, it almost like helped me see before I even understood what it meant to be like conditioned or programmed by society. It was like I was able to see how that happens. And so it almost like automatically provided me with a more accepting kind of approach to other people. And it's interesting because then I went on to get like my master's in cultural anthropology. And in that field, there's this terminology for kind of people like me. We're called halfies, where like we study or research our like our roots, where we're from, but we're also part of a different world, a different culture that gives us a unique perspective on those roots so that we can see them in a way that people who are really like deeply embedded and haven't been exposed to other perspectives, like in a way that they're not able to sort of wrap their mind around.
Yeah.
So yeah, it really is like you can understand how to navigate a lot more like complexity and nuance. I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of feel, again, it's a big responsibility to hold when you have that perspective and you have that sort of insight and sort of again like being the bridge to maybe family members who are stuck in their ways or stuck in, again, it's all that they know, it's their surrounding, it's their culture. And so it can be really harder for them to break out of it. Did you feel any tension kind of as you were developing these ideas within yourself, within your family? Was there some discord as you progressed down that road?
Yes, because I've always been very, very opinionated. Even though I'm very like accepting of different perspectives, I'm also have very strong convictions about my own. And especially when it comes to inclusion, exclusion, justice, belonging, like all of that has something I've been very passionate about since I was a kid, and I was always very outspoken about it. So, and I grew up in the South, where the southeast of the US, where there's a lot of racism, and there are a lot of just perspectives or worldviews that really didn't align with my own. And I really was vocal about it. And most of my family, they just don't really see things the way that I see them. And so I definitely created a lot of tension. And sometimes even when these topics come up, it's like you can already tell that people are just like hoping that I'm not going to speak. Because because I really like
It's uncomfortable for them. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Like I really will call out comments or behaviors or thoughts, like, kind of mindset that I think is harmful and oppressive, and that hasn't always been received well. And like I mentioned my grandfather before, right? And he was very vocal about his hatred of Turkish people. And I was very vocal that I didn't agree with that. And that was also considered, disrespectful because he's
An
my
elder.
elder,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, someone I'm supposed to really revere and honor, and me going against his beliefs like really didn't align with that. So yeah, I kind of am known for creating a bit of tension around these topics.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's just par for the course, right? Like in order to break the cycles, there has to be somebody who is actively working against them or actively questioning. I feel like that is something that really lacks in a lot of those mentalities of these cultures that kind of are born into beliefs. They're surrounded by those beliefs, but they don't ask any questions as to like, what is the root of that and where does it really come from? And is it valid or something that I need to carry, or can I maybe leave it to the side? So, talking about obviously the shadow self, I kind of wanted to move into now that we have a good understanding of like on a grander scale and how we can start to have those conversations or just kind of stand up for human rights, essentially, when it comes down to it. But how do you go about, when you're looking at the shadow self with either your clients or even within yourself, where is a place that you typically start to uncover those layers?
Really, I ask a set of questions that are meant to highlight kind of unconscious beliefs or patterns, and they're very simple. They're very simple questions. Um, but what it really helps do is uncover where people are kind of holding on to an unconscious bias toward other people that they don't see as actually a reflection of themselves, of their own beliefs, their own practices, right? It's something that they very much have disassociated from in a way. And so I will offer the set of questions, and then I can see very clearly like the themes or the patterns that come up in the responses. But it's so interesting because even though they're literally written out, almost always the other person is not able to see their own role in it. It's very interesting. And so we can see that a lot of the things that we are sort of judging or criticizing other people for, or things that really we're like, oh, I can't stand when people do XYZ, it's so often a reflection of something we've repressed in ourselves. And usually we repress these parts of self because of shame in some way. So either, right, like it's not really a socially acceptable sort of trait or behavior, or it's something that we really internalized from childhood that like I won't be loved or accepted if I show this part of me. And it's not always bad stuff. Like sometimes it's really someone's gift or their
Yeah.
strength, but they think that, oh, well, like, no, I'm not supposed to be this way, right? It's just all about our kind of conditioning and programming.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think all of us experience that to some extent at different varying levels. But, as children, we have these big ideas, maybe we have these talents and they're not always supported, or they're looked at as unrealistic or not of the mold. You know what I mean? So I could see that kind of being a difficult thing for people to face. I mean, shadow work in and of itself is so difficult because you literally have to lay everything out and look at it straight away. And so what are some of the, I guess, common themes that you see most often in the people that you work with, or I guess just in general, since you've been doing this focus around shadow work?
I mean, the main theme that comes through is just really like what I spoke about before, this like disconnection from
Mm,
self. It really is that either big traumatic experiences or the accumulation of what has felt traumatic in someone's life, that those things have led people to create a sort of persona, and that persona really represents this disconnection from self. And so often we think like, oh, like this is my personality, this is just like the way that I am, these you know these are my sort of characteristics, but so often our personality is actually a persona that's rooted in a trauma response. And so it's not really a reflection of our essence. And so a lot of the work that I do is really about helping people like almost repair that relationship with themselves and reclaim parts of self that have been repressed or suppressed. And you know, when I see this, of course, I'm working primarily right now, at least, with people who really are purpose driven and want to make an impact in the world, and they want to see change, and they're, you know, they're like do-gooders. But I think even when we look at people who maybe it seems intentionally, I'm not sure if it is actually their intention, but who cause harm or who oppress other people, that, I mean, it's the same thing. That's reflection that is reflecting a disconnection from self, because it's like the trauma would be so painful to look at or to reconcile, that the person is so disassociated from the root of the trauma, the impact of the trauma. And, you know, when we're actively causing harm to other people, I really think that that is rooted in deep, deep pain that we're unable to look at. And the only way that we can feel some sense of agency or autonomy or control over our own lives is to take that away from somebody else. Really, it's really like a lack of inner power, right? That leads to that. Because if we're really connected to our power, which I think is like the truth of who we are, our true essence, there is no need to do anything harmful to anyone else. But when you feel almost like powerless in your life, right? Like you will look for ways to feel powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Different people do that in different ways, right?
No, absolutely. I think I saw this quote actually a couple weeks ago, something about like the reason that we have all this discord and wars is it's just a bunch of unhealed inner children essentially running around.
Right.
And that's obviously such a broad statement, but I fully believe that as well. I mean, like you said, you know, these people who have all these issues that they don't face, they're building up layers and layers and layers of defense. And then again, trying to project that onto other people so that they can have a sense of control that they've lost because they're just not even in control of themselves or their emotions. Do you have any ideas as to like how we can bridge the gap between, because obviously, you know, the people who seek out the work that you're doing, again, they're purpose driven, they're kind of on that path. Have you seen or have you come across any insight as to like how we can bridge that gap for the people who are so unhealed, so blocked from even facing these things? Like, how do we make that connection for them?
Yeah. I really think that it is like in the most basic way of expressing it, it's really about holding space for their pain. So, like witnessing people and what they're experiencing and allowing them. I mean, it sounds, I think, counterintuitive in a lot of ways to be like, yeah, let's create safety for people who cause harm. But I really think that that's what's needed. And my interest in the shadow, you know, I mean, I've been really obsessed since I was a little kid with understanding like the quote unquote dark things that people do. I've always loved watching stories about like crimes and murders, and it's not because I like think it's so fascinating that we, you know, that we can hurt other people in this kind of way, but I'm very interested in the psychological processes that lead people to behave in certain ways. And for me, my interest in this like shadow is really about cultivating capacity for compassion and empathy. Because also I think when we become more intimately familiar with our own shadow and how it plays out in ways we're like so unaware of, then we see what we ourselves have capacity for, that there is actually this capacity within all of us to do things that we might say, oh, I would never do that. And I think that cultivating more compassion toward our humanity, like our really the ways in which we human that lends itself to transforming kind of the norm of the way that we move through the world, which is really disconnected from our humanity, right? And so yeah, I mean, there are lots of layers to that, right? And lots of different sort of sides from which to approach the challenge, but I think that it really is like rooted in having compassion and empathy for pain.
Yeah. No, I fully agree with that. And as you mentioned already too, it's like when we heal ourselves or we look at our shadows on an individual basis, again, like with the collective energies, it's like you're allowing for a higher vibration, you're allowing for more openness to surround you. It's a ripple effect, it starts to progress over into other populations and other people, but it always starts with the self. But outside of just doing the inner work, again, like holding that space is so important. I think it can be really easy in today's world to get wrapped up in the negativity and the horror and the trauma of the world that's happening and going to anger or frustration. Not to say that those aren't valid feelings, right? But again, kind of like trying to find the compassion, trying to hold some space for understanding. It's not easy all the time, but I agree. I think it's so important and necessary in order for those people to have that flexibility and space to eventually move into something higher or something, more inner knowledge and power.
Yeah, because in the end, like all of these issues are really rooted in fear
Mhm.
and in self-protection, right? So there are some people in the world who they really internalize their traumatic experiences and blame themselves and make themselves small. Then there are other people who really externalize and blame other people and try to make other people small. But regardless of like how we go about coping, it really is both sides are a reflection of a protective mechanism that's rooted in fear. And so I think we have to like hold space for that fear, like to hold space for the things that actually create the disconnection from self.
Yeah. Talking about again the work that you're doing, on the individual basis, I guess what sort of shifts or changes do you see in how you approach, going from groups to individual? Like, what does that look like for you when you're, having to shift from like a one-on-one versus like doing those group sessions you discussed?
Yeah, so I'm just finding, after, I mean, I spent like 15 years where everything I did was focused on in a group context, and now the last five, one-on-one. And now like I mentioned, I see myself right moving back into the group space because I think such a big component of my own sort of perspective or approach or the way that I like to facilitate an experience is really about creating space for vulnerability and transparency and for people to build connections with each other, especially right as I mentioned before with kind of my past life, building connections and bridges across difference and different beliefs, different worldviews, different sort of lenses of morality and ethics. And so I just think when we're talking about creating collective change, the group context really allows for a different kind of awareness and transformation to come through. When we're in those kinds of spaces, that's really where we are given the opportunity to witness
Mhm.
another's humanity, to break down the walls that we've built. And there's a lot of value in doing the work, like doing aspects of that work on yourself and with yourself and on your own. But I also think it's kind of like part of the power or the purpose of even doing that is to bring it into the collective. So
Right.
yeah, I
And
just
I think too, you mentioned like within the group, something really important is like just even getting to witness other people's vulnerability, other people's compassion, their traumas, like being around it. Again, going back to just that common thread of like our humanity and how we all intrinsically have that. We're all humans, right? So, because I think about even like in my upbringing from a traditional Filipino household, there were certain things that were passed down to me, whether it be like some like light racism or homophobia and things like that, I had to grow out of. And thankfully, because I was exposed, here in the US, we see so many different types of people all around us if you're living in a diverse population. And it was through that exposure that I was able to be like, no, I think they just, like different things, or they just have different color skin and they just look a little different. But again, it's really hard when you're in kind of like a all one culture, all one skin type, all one, it's a lot more difficult for them to kind of see the humanity in others because they're not around it. As far as anything else that you can share, whether it be just like beginner tips on starting to work with the shadow, like where somebody can start with that, or any other insight that you can provide to people who are curious about, learning more about this work.
Yeah. Well, actually, the word you just said is for me a big starting point, and that's curiosity. And, curiosity opens our mind up to possibility. And I think that's really important, right? That open-mindedness, and to get curious, like, oh, like why do I react so strongly to X? Or when this thing happens, why do I feel so moved? Why do I take that so personally? It's really getting curious about our own feelings and reactions and responses to life, and curious about the reactions and responses of others. So, sometimes we'll be with somebody and something happens and we feel that their reaction is just completely disproportionate to the context, right? But usually that reaction is rooted in something in the past. And it's actually a response to something that isn't even happening in the present. Yeah. And we do the same thing ourselves, right? And so just being curious, like, oh, well, what sort of triggers that, or what leads to this certain belief or this certain insecurity or this certain reaction, So I really think being curious and also just courageous, because it takes a lot of bravery to be willing to look at things. I mean, there's a reason why we repress parts of self. It's because we don't want to look at it. It's too uncomfortable. And so, yeah, getting curious and then just practicing courage.
Yeah, that's a huge part, because it's a lot easier to just kind of take it as it is, not question things, just say, okay, well, this is what the cards I've been dealt, or this is the opinions and things that I was raised into. So I'm just going to hold on to those. But yeah, that curiosity and then the courage, because just as you spoke to in your experience, it can cause for divides in families, friend groups. When you start to question certain things, maybe you've been around people who are stuck in their ways or aren't looking at those things. And so once you start, it's not an easy process, and it does take that additional level of strength and kind of like inner knowing and, again, inner power to say, like, this doesn't resonate with me, or I don't feel like what you're telling me is all that there is to it. So let me explore deeper. It takes a lot to get to that point.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I have absolutely loved this conversation. Again, I think what you're doing is so important in today's world, and anybody can benefit from looking at their shadows and looking at other people's shadows and what drives them, and why people do the things that they do, not just accepting it as is. I'd love to give you the opportunity to share how people can find you and how they might be able to work with you.
Yeah, well, I'm just really grateful to be here, and thank you for creating the space for me to share all of this. If people are interested in doing shadow work, they should definitely look me up. You can find me on either Instagram or my website, and they're both like my name, Lena Papadopoulos. So I'm sure you'll share the spelling of that.
Yes, I know. It's quite a few letters, so we'll make sure that we get that spelled right in the description so that people can connect with you. And so grateful to have the space with you to share in this conversation. Again, so meaningful and powerful to encourage others to do the work that is not easy.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode or any previous episodes, please don't forget to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast. I'm so excited for some of the upcoming content, and can't wait to share with you so soon. Until then, bye for now.